Welcome to today's Explainer, where we're going to act as your guide through a vibrant, completely turbulent century of British literature. Today, we're actually treating history itself as our ultimate classroom teacher. We'll be looking at how 100 years of relentless societal shockwaves literally rewrote the rulebook of English poetry.
So before we crack open our textbooks, let's ponder this grand overarching question. As the British Empire faced world wars, total economic collapse, and eventual decolonization, how on earth did its poets find the words to capture such a radically changing reality? Because, when the world turns upside down, the old metaphors, they just don't work anymore.
Okay, here's our syllabus for today's lesson. We're covering 1. War and modernist shocks. 2. The political 30s. 3. WII and the movement. 4. Nature and the Martians. And finally, 5. Redefining British identity.
Now, to give you a clear roadmap of our lesson, this timeline maps out the massive historical upheavals of the 20th century. I want you to think of these events as strict, unforgiving instructors. They basically forced each new generation of poets to fundamentally rebel against the generation that came right before them, just to make sense of their present reality.
All right, Section 1, War and Modernist Shocks. Let's dive right into an era where the quiet rural poetry of the Edwardians was violently interrupted.
Our first major shift is a really stark, brutal contrast. On one side, we've got the Georgian poets, right? Guys like Walter de la Mare, who wrote these heavily sentimental verses about fairies, dreams, and unearthly countryside atmospheres. They practically ignored the looming socio-political problems. But then, bam, the Great War hits. And poets like Siegfried Sassoon and Wilfred Owen brought stark, horrific realism straight from the trenches. They completely rejected romanticized patriotism. Instead, they replaced traditional poetic diction with anti-romantic, colloquial language to describe mutilated soldiers and the true, gritty horrors of gas attacks.
You've absolutely got to take note of this famous declaration by Wilfred Owen. It practically became the slogan for all war poetry. Owen showed us that the senseless death of young men on the battlefield left zero room for the glorification of conflict. There were no heroes in his verses, only young men struggling with physical disability and horrific memories. The poetry wasn't in the glory, it was entirely in the pity.
Following the war, this profound disillusionment birthed modernism. The old religious certainties and absolute moral standards, they had completely collapsed. Towering figures like T.S. Eliot stepped in, using myth, complex symbols, and disjointed urban imagery to portray a decaying, spiritually bankrupt civilization. As we see in works like The Wasteland, objective truth felt impossible. So the poetry itself became dense, fragmented, and notoriously difficult, perfectly reflecting a fractured world.
And as the American-born poet Ezra Pound commanded with this famous phrase, the modernists were relentless risk-takers. They found a certain revolutionary satisfaction in violating sacrosanct literary conventions. They weren't just writing poems, they were actively rebelling against Victorian formalism to properly reflect their chaotic, modernized reality. Moving right along to Section 2, the political 30s. Let's see how the subsequent generation, facing a brand new set of crises, rebelled against those very modernists.
As the 1930s rolled in, the world plunged toward the Great Depression, and the terrifying shadow of fascism loomed over Europe. The artistic focus had to shift dramatically. Poets could no longer afford to just look inward at the psychological depths of the individual, The dire state of the world forced them to turn sharply outward towards society.
The crucial point here is the ideological contrast. The 1930s poets, led by figures like W.H. Auden and Stephen Spender, heavily criticized the elitist difficulty of 1920s modernism. They felt modernism was just for a select few. So instead, they opted to use everyday speech, colloquialisms, and highly accessible rhythms. They were deeply politically engaged, often drawing on Marxist philosophy to advocate for social reforms and champion the cause of the working class against exploitation. They essentially rehumanized the poetic subject.
Okay, Section 3, WW and the movement. Our lesson now brings us to the grim reality of 1939.
Facing unprecedented global violence, the poets of World War II, folks like Dylan Thomas and Sidney Keys, found themselves entirely stripped of the idealism of the previous decade. It just wasn't possible to write poetry of propaganda, warnings, or militarism anymore. The old metaphors were completely useless against such devastation. Instead, they retreated into deep introspection, making a conscious choice to simply record their contradictory, non-judgmental responses to a crumbling civilization.
After the literal and figurative dust settled, the 1950s gave us what was termed the movement. These poets completely rejected both the international complexity of the modernists and the grand, chaotic, romantic emotions of the past. They wanted clear, rational craftsmanship. They firmly believed poetry should be guided by logic and a strict discipline of feelings, preferring to write about everyday situations in a way that common readers could just spontaneously enjoy.
A leading figure of this era was Philip Larkin. His supposedly simple poetry was actually incredibly powerful. He offered a profound sincerity and intimacy that questioned institutional orthodoxy, like in his poem Churchgoing, purely through the lens of ordinary, everyday experiences. It was a decidedly English freshness, completely rejecting internationalized styles.
Section 4. Nature and the Martians. Moving into the late 20th century, we see poets finding delightfully shocking new ways to observe the world. Let's look at Ted Hughes. He developed a striking animalist tradition. But for Hughes, nature wasn't some pretty, romantic landscape. Not at all. He used fierce, unsmiling descriptions of the natural world as an arena for dark instincts and a constant, brutal battle for survival. By writing about the sheer cruelty of animals, he was actually creating a striking metaphor for the tragic, inexpressibly cruel reality of human existence itself. But then, in stark, vibrant contrast to that darkness, the late 1970s brought us the quirky Martian school, pioneered by Craig Raine. The goal here was defamiliarization, basically teaching us to look at mundane, everyday things as if we were an alien seeing them for the very first time. I mean, imagine playfully describing a pug dog as a car crash, or the moon in the morning looking like fat in a frying pan. It's a wildly creative, incredibly sharp way to just reinvigorate our perspective on the world. Section 5. Redefining British Identity. For our final, and honestly, perhaps most important lesson today, we must look at how the very definition of British poetry was completely revolutionized.
By the late 20th century, the coherent, traditional idea of Englishness cracked under the pressure of formerly marginalized voices asserting their identities. Scottish poets like Hugh MacDiarmid and Irish powerhouses like Seamus Heaney proudly reclaimed their native dialects, local histories, and tribal passions. They flat-out rejected the strict, traditional voice of authority, what was often seen as that traditional, patriarchal BBC English. They proved that great poetry absolutely didn't have to sound like the Oxford establishment.
Simultaneously, the massive influx of immigrants from former colonies gave rise to Black British poetry. Poets migrating from the Caribbean and Africa brought vital, dynamic new rhythms. They deliberately used Creole or nation language as a powerful means to fight back against the dominant culture. This was dub, beat, and performance poetry. It was highly political, full of satire, addressing racism and hardship directly, and actively subverting standard English expectations with incredible, raw energy. Benjamin Zephaniah absolutely hit the nail on the head here. This quote perfectly captures the vibrant energy of this era. He was taking poetry out of the stuffy textbooks and bringing rhythm, life, and fierce populist appeal directly to the streets and the youth. It was a profound statement that poetry isn't just an elite academic exercise, right? It's a living, breathing expression of a community's heartbeat. To sum up our masterclass today, the evolution of poetry across these 100 years perfectly mirrors a society in massive transition. We literally watched poetry transform from the isolated, imperial nostalgia of the Edwardian era into a complex, decentralized, and brilliantly diverse post-imperial reality. The changing world dictated the changing word. Well, class is just about dismissed, but I want to leave you with this final thought. Based on everything we've learned today about how chaos and societal shockwaves breed necessary new art, who are the outsiders today? As our modern world continues to be reshaped by new conflicts and global migrations, whose untraditional voices are, right now, quietly writing the required reading of tomorrow? Keep your eyes and your ears wide open.